Whether you enjoy mysterious disappearances or unexplainable UFO sightings, there are plenty of historical mysteries for you to sink your teeth into. As the years go by, some of these mysteries are solved, putting an end to decades of investigations and questioning. But not everything in our world is so easily explainable, and there are a few bizarre mysteries that still linger. Taos, located in New Mexico, was once known as a relaxed community, filled with those who had their own artistic expression in mind. Day-to-day life floated by without any interruption. That was until the early 1990s. Since then, the town of Taos has been engulfed in one of the weirdest unsolved historical mysteries. There's no official date as to when the mysterious hum was first heard, but sources tend to pinpoint the date as being in the early 1990s. There was chatter around Taos about the mysterious humming noise, and only a few people could hear it. Experts were called in the early 1990s to conduct a full investigation and report on the buzzing noise. The mysterious buzz was found to be between 32 Hz and 80 Hz, and those who could hear it, called hearers, reported that it could only be heard when it was cool outside with a light breeze. For clarity, human ears can detect sounds from 20 Hz to 20 kHz, so this mysterious buzzing was well within the range of hearing for a human. Research continued into the bizarre hum. Some people described it as a whir or a buzz, while others said that it was a hum. What was even stranger was that people would continue hearing the noise when they were miles away from Taos, leading some people to believe that something paranormal or otherworldly was happening. Scientists were unable to find any explanation for the hum. Equipment that is used to measure sound waves and vibrations was fitted around the hum's hotspots, but nothing was ever found. Scientists were now faced with a mystery. Around 2% of the population could hear this mysterious hum, and they claimed that it was interfering with their daily lives. With no proof or explanation, the investigation came to a standstill. One theory that was posed was that those who heard the hum were either superhearers or were hearing the hum simply because they had focused on it. Our lives are filled with noise, and it's only when we tune in and listen that we discover the subtle background noises that fill our ears on a daily basis. An article for Live Science demonstrated this awareness by posing the question, "What does your tongue taste like?" It's not something we notice until we focus on it and pay close attention to it. Of course, others suggested that heavy machinery was responsible, and that the hearers simply had good hearing. Another theory is that the hum is being emitted by a UFO hidden somewhere within Taos. New Mexico is no stranger to bizarre UFO and alien activity, and following Roswell in 1947, there's been a keen interest in aliens. Scientists are still working on the mysterious Taos hum and other hums across the world. While people have been exploring this hum since the early 1990s, scientists have never been able to find a solid answer. And until science progresses, it appears that the Taos hum will remain yet another historical mystery. November 24th, 1971, marks the 51st anniversary since the infamous D.B. Cooper made international headlines. For almost 51 years, the FBI has desperately been trying to track down this wanted man, and the world has looked on waiting for answers to the decades-long mystery. On November 24th, 1971, a man calling himself Dan Cooper boarded a plane from Portland, Oregon to Seattle, Washington. Just hours earlier, he had purchased his ticket, given his name as Dan Cooper, and had joined the hundreds of other travelers waiting in the lounge. Nobody could have anticipated what was about to unfold. As passengers piled onto Flight 305, headed for Seattle, everyone braced for takeoff and prayed for a safe flight. Unfortunately, shortly after the plane had reached altitude, Dan Cooper summoned an air stewardess and slipped her a note, telling her that he had weapons and that she needed to sit with him. The air was thick with tension, and after showing the woman his briefcase, he made his demands. Dan Cooper ordered the stewardess to take a note to the pilot, asking for $200,000 in $20 bills and 4 parachutes. The crew on board did their best to contain the situation and keep the passengers calm. As the plane cruised towards Seattle and prepared to land, the crew and pilot knew what they needed to do. The plane landed in Seattle and the passengers quickly disembarked, leaving Dan Cooper and the crew members still on board. His demands were met and $200,000 and 4 parachutes were handed over. And at a moment's notice, the plane had taken off again, this time headed for Mexico City. By this point, the event had hit the headlines, and reporters scrambled to both the airport in Portland and Seattle to get the inside scoop. While reporters hurried towards the airport, so did the FBI and local authorities, who began interviewing everyone who had made contact with Dan Cooper. Witnesses described Dan Cooper as being a white male in his mid-40s and around 6 feet tall. He was wearing a smart suit with a black tie, and other than that, he was nondescript and very run-of-the-mill. It was clear that Dan had gone to great efforts to make himself blend in and look ordinary. There was nothing about him that stood out to those in the airport, which worked to Dan's advantage. Almost 51 years later, this is the description that is still widely circulated by the FBI, and we are no closer to unraveling the mystery. As the airplane cruised over Seattle and into Nevada, Dan Cooper left his seat, put on a parachute, and jumped out of the back of the plane with his $200,000 in tow. This was the last time that Dan Cooper was ever seen or heard from. This mystery has captivated people across the world, and despite the multiple resources at hand, the FBI has never been able to solve the case. Dan's name is often falsely reported as D.B. Cooper, although the name on his plane ticket was Dan Cooper. This identity was looked into and it was found out to be fake. There has only been one breakthrough in this case, and that was in 1980, when $5,800 was found buried along the Columbia River close to Portland, Oregon. The serial numbers on these bills match the serial numbers given to Dan Cooper on that fateful November day. As of 2016, the FBI has reallocated resources away from the Dan Cooper investigation to other cold cases. It's not known whether Dan survived and who he really was. This endearing historical mystery is nearing its 51st anniversary, and the FBI is no closer to uncovering the truth. In 1982, Robert Marks, an American diver and marine archaeologist, was searching through the Guanabara Bay in Brazil, looking for hidden treasures to unearth. Marks came across more than he could have bargained for, and is responsible for one of Brazil's weirdest historical mysteries. As Robert was making his way through the waters, something caught his eye. He swam closer and discovered that the things that caught his eye were clay jars covered in thick barnacles. Robert was over the moon with his discovery and quickly surfaced to tell others what he had found. Before leaving, Robert snapped a few photos and headed to the surface. Robert identified the objects as amphorae, which were jars used by the ancient Romans to carry wine and other liquids onto ships during long journeys. Other experts were consulted who agreed that these jars were likely of Roman origin. The story hit the news, and the worlds of historians and archaeologists were abuzz with excitement. The latest discovery could prove that the Portuguese were not the first to discover Brazil after all. This discovery also had huge implications for South American history, and these amphorae may have proven that the ancient Romans were in fact the first Europeans to set foot there. When the Brazilian government caught wind of this discovery, they were quick to downplay the event and quickly banned anyone from exploring the waters in Guanabara Bay. Robert was denied access to the bay after he expressed plans of excavating it, and since then the mystery of the Bay of Jars has remained unsolved. Robert believed that the jars possibly indicated the existence of a Roman shipwreck and wanted to conduct further research. Robert has since passed away in 2019, and the Brazilian government still refuses access to the mysterious Bay of Jars. While the Hanging Gardens of Babylon is considered to be one of the 7 wonders of the world, nobody actually knows where it was located. The gardens are now believed to be located within the walls of the Babylon Royal Palace, in what is now modern-day Iraq. but there has been no archaeological evidence to prove this. For centuries, historians, archaeologists, and other experts have been on the hunt for these mysterious gardens, and some people have even pondered whether these gardens actually existed or not. The ancient city of Babylon stood as the capital of the Babylonian Empire and played a crucial role throughout history. While in modern times, Babylon sits in what is now Iraq, there is still much intrigue and mystery surrounding the city and what lies within. One such mystery is the mystery of the Hanging Gardens. Historical sources describe the gardens as flourishing terraces, covered in foliage, fed by irrigation pumps, and that this garden was high up within the walls of the palace. Nobody has ever been able to conclusively confirm who built the gardens, or even when they were built. It's believed that many people, including scholars, made trips to see the gardens in all of their glory. And in 250 BC, Philo of Byzantium visited the gardens. Aside from these writings, there's very little evidence to work with, and since the fall of Babylon, experts have been stumped. Various digs and excavations have taken place, but there is yet to be any sign of the infamous Hanging Gardens. Some historians have even argued that the gardens didn't exist, or at least did not exist in Babylon. For centuries, we've been trying to figure out the mystery of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, and until solid evidence comes to light, the location of the Hanging Gardens remains a historical mystery that might never be solved. The disappearance of the crew from the MV Joa has haunted investigators for decades, and despite an intensive investigation, nobody has ever been able to solve the case. On October 3rd, 1955, the MV Joa, with 16 crew members, 9 passengers, and 4 tons of cargo on board, set sail from Samoa headed to Tokelau, over 360 miles away. The journey should have taken them just 2 days, but as October came and went, there was no sign of the MV Joa or its crew, and people began to panic. Captain Thomas Henry Miller had purchased the ship in 1952 and had used it to run supplies and people around Samoa and the various other islands around it. Miller was no stranger to the seas and knew how to navigate them properly, even in the event of a problem. As the days passed and there was no word from the MV Joa, panic set in. It wasn't until March 10, 1955 that the first clue was discovered. On that day, a merchant ship came across the MV Joa, tipped on its side. The merchant ship drew closer and noticed that there were no signs of life and that the ship seemed in a bad way. They decided to board and found no new crew members or passengers to speak of. They also found that the MV Joa's radio was tuned to 2182 kHz, which is the International Marine Distress Radio channel. After taking the ship to shore, it was discovered that the MV Joa should have docked in Tokelau over a month earlier. Now, investigators were faced with the question of how the MV Joa had ended up 600 miles away from its destination port. What was more troubling was the fact that a search party had covered thousands of miles looking for the ship in the days after its disappearance, but had found nothing, and all of a sudden it had appeared out of thin air, over 600 miles away. The inside of the ship showed troubling signs. The bridge had been smashed, the logbooks and equipment were gone, as were 3 lifeboats. All that remained was some of the cargo and a doctor's bag, giving a chilling insight as to what could have possibly happened on board. It was also found that the ship had been running on a single engine, and that the clutch and pumps had been disconnected. Water had flooded the lower decks, but according to experts, the MV Joa was not at a risk of sinking. One theory suggests that perhaps those on board panicked, jumped into the lifeboats, and floated out to sea, never to be seen again. The radio range on board had also been hampered, transmitting to just under 2 miles away. There have been no sightings of those on board, and what really happened that day remains a bizarre mystery. Before making history in a weird way, the SS Cap Trafalgar was one of the most luxurious ocean liner passenger ships, ferrying passengers from Germany to South America. Months after it first set sail, World War I broke out, and the German ship was refitted for duties and repainted to look like a British ship. The Cap Trafalgar was supposed to attack unsuspecting merchant ships in the South Atlantic. The plan was to blend in with British ships before raising the German flag and causing havoc. But the Trafalgar failed this mission and was eager for a second chance to make world history. On September 14, 1914, the ship was near the Trindade Island off the coast of Brazil, where the Germans had set up a secret supply station. They were with 2 other German colliers when another much larger ship appeared on the horizon. This was the Carmania, commanded by Captain Noel Grant. Like the Cap Trafalgar, the Carmania had an early history as a civilian cruise liner, and was then refitted for the war. It was older than the Trafalgar, but bigger. The Trafalgar might have been able to fool the Carmania had the ship not been repainted to look almost exactly like the Carmania. Some historical accounts say the ship was trying to replicate the Carmania, down to the last detail, but the true untold story was that they were simply using similar colors as the ship's manufacturer, a company called Castle Liner. Either way, the unconventional disguise did somewhat confuse the sailors aboard the Carmania briefly, as they saw a much smaller version of their own ship, but they knew there weren't any British ships in the area, and they didn't know why a British ship would be getting help from German coal ships. As the Trafalgar tried to flee, British sailors were ordered to fire a warning shot. The Trafalgar swiftly responded, and they battled for a little under 2 hours until a fire started on the Carmania that could not be put out. The history of the Trafalgar ended at this battle as it sank below the water. Most of the sailors aboard the Trafalgar were rescued by the colliers and other German warships. Too damaged to rescue survivors, and with most navigational equipment lost, the Carmania began a legendary journey back to port. The HMS Cornwall came to the rescue about a day later. Historians note that the Carmania most likely would have spent the rest of history at the bottom of the ocean had they not been rescued on that day. All of the lifeboats were likewise full of holes. The Carmania was sent to Gibraltar for repairs, and saw out the rest of the war in a series of other incredible historical events. None of the surviving crew would ever forget the strange but true history behind the 2 converted cruise liners that once did battle to the bitter end. The Russo-Japanese War is a relatively little-known war that took place between the 2 empires shortly before the historical events of the First World War. It was an unbelievably embarrassing defeat for Russia, but some of the most embarrassing moments of history take place on the other side of the world. Russia needed to send reinforcements quickly after their Pacific fleet was destroyed by Japanese torpedoes. Dispatching a fleet from the Black Sea was the quickest option that Russia had, but the nearby Ottomans wouldn't allow them, which meant a much less competent crew in the Baltic Sea was their only option. Manned by peasant conscripts, the inexperienced Second Pacific Fleet made some big historical mistakes. When they weren't ramming into each other, the ships were regularly getting lost. One ship, the Kamchatka, disappeared and returned with battle stories of nearby Japanese torpedo boats. Proud of their victory, but terrified now that the rumors of the Japanese forces were true, they entered British territorial waters, barely dodging minefields set by the enemy all the while. At about 60 miles from the coast of England, the Second Pacific Fleet then spotted a group of 40 Japanese boats. For the next 25 minutes, the Russian ships protected England from the menacing threat and won. They sped off shortly afterwards in what would later be known as the Dogger Bank Incident. In one of the biggest and strangest blunders in maritime history, the Second Pacific Fleet had actually been firing on merchant fishing ships who were signaling at them to stop the entire time. There were no Japanese enemies anywhere in sight. And even more embarrassing, the Russians had mistakenly targeted each other along with the fishing boats, largely missing most of their shots in the confusion. Sadly, a small number of the fishing boats were struck, and 3 men lost their lives. But the fact remains that these history moments could have been unbelievably worse had their aim been true. The story told by Kamchata was likewise an embarrassing mistake in which civilian vessels were seen as Japanese forces. In this case, the boat had gotten lost and engaged a fleeing merchant ship and a trawler. And of course, there were no minefields like they had feared. The unbelievable attack, though accidental, was not without historical consequences. Britain banned the Russian fleet from using the Suez Canal, even when the officers deemed responsible were sent back to Russia. The fleet now had to travel a much longer route around Africa, where the tropical climate led to disease and exhaustion. Those that did make it to Japanese waters were soon defeated by the better prepared and trained Japanese forces, ending this weird history story. The 1908 New York to Paris auto race was one of the strangest motoring events in world history. 6 cars left New York Times Square in February of 1908. Only 3 would make it to Paris in July and September. In the time between, there are strange stories of a threatened duel, a failed attempt to drive through Alaska, and a petrol shortage that led to one of the competitors trying to ransom his way onto another team. Of the 6 cars that started the race, 2 wouldn't make it out of the US at all. One of the 3 French entrants dropped out 96 miles from the starting line. Another made it to San Francisco, but only after being shipped by railroad, at which point the car owners sent a dispatch to the driver to tell him to sell the car and come home. What remained were 4 cars from America, France, Italy, and Germany. As history would have it, it wasn't long before a strange series of petty arguments broke out among the competitors. At one point, the German team sent a letter to the Chicago Automobile Club to ask for help with an unusual complaint. Their story spoke of locals who were shoveling snow that had been cleared from the American team back onto the road and charging them to sleep on the floor. The letter did not help much, and the local papers published their untold story under the headline "Foreigners' Pathetic Appeal." Meanwhile, on the American team, a mechanic named George Schuster did most of the work. Their driver, Montague Roberts, bizarrely left the race in Wyoming in favor of competing in a more traditional motor race in Europe. Another professional driver took over for a while, but it was Schuster who drove through Russia and Europe. But the biggest source of drama came from the French team. At the start of the race, G. Bussier de Saint-Chaffrey was joined by a Norwegian man named Hans Hendrik Hansen, who claimed to have a weird sailing history full of unlikely events, including one taking a Viking ship solo all the way to the North Pole, as literal fact. While in Colorado, their car had ended up in a snowdrift. After arguing about how to get it out, they agreed to settle the matter with a duel. It didn't get far, fortunately, and Hansen was fired by Saint-Chaffrey. The major problem for all the teams, and the strangest part of this story that often goes untold, was how they were going to get from America to Russia. Originally, the plan had been to drive through Alaska onto a bridge of ice that would connect Alaska to Russia and into Siberia. Upon arriving in Alaska, it soon became clear that there was no way anybody could drive through it. The fact that the Bering Strait that separates America and Russia doesn't completely freeze over anymore also hindered crossing. In the end, the cars were shipped to Russia, where they soon found there was no gasoline. Saint-Chaffrey had bought what little petrol there was in the area and demanded that either Italians or the American team take him with them, as he didn't think his own car would win, but both turned him down. Saint-Chaffrey's sponsor pulled him out of the race. The historic event certainly had a strange and unexpected ending. The German team would actually make it to Paris first, arriving on July 26th, 4 days before the American car. However, the German car had been given a time penalty for traveling part of the journey by train, and Schuster and the American car were declared the winner. The Italian team arrived in September. The confusing conclusion would not become commonplace, and it remains a strange but true story from the early days of a historical motor vehicle competition around the world. To many, the true story of Pepsi's Navy division has been largely forgotten by history. It's an untold event that has much more to do with American politics than it first seems, and also shows how historical events can be stranger than fiction. The true history story of Pepsis Navy began at the 1959 American National Exhibition in Moscow. The head of Pepsi's international division, Donald Kendall, told the then Vice President Richard Nixon that Pepsi thought attending the exhibition was a waste of money. Nixon decided to prove Pepsi wrong by showing Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev over to the Pepsi stand the next day, and the two world leaders made history by simply sharing the fizzy beverage. This event would create a large Soviet demand for Pepsi, although it would still be almost a decade before everyday citizens of the USSR would be able to afford it. Even then, the country could barely afford to import the sugary drink. But Pepsi kept developing its friendship with Richard Nixon, who had lost two important elections. As the head of Pepsi, Kendall announced that any law firm who supported Nixon would also get Pepsi as a $3 million client. It was a move that helped turn Nixon's career around. Nixon repaid the favor by helping Pepsi make a deal with the USSR. In 1972, in what was certainly a weird moment in trade history, the USSR agreed to trade vodka and tomato paste for Pepsi products, which the soft drink company could then sell in the US or Western Europe. This worked for a while. Pepsi, which owned Pizza Hut, used the tomato paste in pizzas and sold the alcohol as an authentic Soviet product. But Soviet tensions rose, the West boycotted vodka, and it wasn't long before it was clear this wasn't going to work for Pepsi. It was 1989 when another historical solution was proposed, this one twice as bizarre. Instead of tomato paste and vodka, Pepsi was given 17 submarines, a cruiser, and a destroyer in return, all in exchange for their world-famous soft drink. This did technically make them the sixth largest navy in the world at the time, but the vessels Pepsi was given weren't seaworthy. They were immediately scrapped. All of this earned a concerned correspondence between Nixon and Kendall. When asked why a corporation wanted to amass a navy, Kendall simply replied, "I'm dismantling the Soviet Union faster than you are." The next deal involved special oil tankers being specially constructed. Unfortunately for Pepsi, the collapse of the Soviet Union put an end to that deal. But in a weird twist of fate, Russia remains one of Pepsi's biggest markets in recent history. There are many amazing, strange but true stories from the Second World War about incredible people who managed to do incredible things. Douglas Bader was one such individual. Bader was an RAF pilot who quickly became a national hero, despite the RAF being reluctant to field him. That was because he was missing both of his legs. Bader had joined the RAF in 1928 when he was just 18 years old. He was an incredibly talented pilot and was commissioned in 1930. In particular, he liked aerobatics and was known to go against his commanders to pull off some interesting tricks. One of those tricks backfired. On December 14, 1931, the plane touched ground and Bader almost lost his life. He lost his legs at the hospital, but Bader was determined not to let that be the end of his story, and he was fitted with artificial legs. Within a year, Bader was walking, driving a golf cart, and dancing, but he really wanted to get back in a plane. He retrained, and by 1933, the Central Flying School reported he was more than capable of returning to service. He didn't pass the medical exam, though. There was no historical precedent of what to do in this extraordinary situation. When war looked inevitable, Bader's enthusiasm grew. His sister-in-law would later tell the media that Bader said the RAF would have to take him if war broke out. He was right. Bader's first mission was the evacuation of Dunkirk. He quickly rose through the ranks and took charge of a Canadian squadron that had been left in disarray after losing many of its pilots in France. Bader got them back into shape, and the squadron played an important role in the Battle of Britain. By 1941, he was being recognized in Britain for his skills in the air. He'd already made world history by leading squadrons over France and downing many German planes. The German army had also taken notice. In August of 1941, Bader was downed over France. He bailed out of the plane at the last moment. One of his artificial legs became stuck and fell with the plane, while Bader parachuted into the hands of the Germans. As a formidable foe, Bader was well respected even by the Germans in St. Omer, who offered clear passage for a plane to drop over St. Omer a replacement leg stump, socks, tobacco, and chocolate. They also took the opportunity to do a normal raid over a German-occupied base. As soon as he got his leg, Bader climbed out of a hospital window using a bedsheet rope. It was the first of 3 escape attempts. On another attempt, he was found because a German officer had wanted to meet the British ace and had come to the camp to meet him. He was noticed missing sooner than normal and was soon caught. Bader saw out the end of the war from Colditz Castle, a place specifically designed to prevent escapes, where he was kept from 1942 until it was liberated by the American Army. In 1971, Canadian director Norman Jewison bought the rights to make a film adaptation of the 1963 novel The Incomparable Atuk, planning to shoot it after his 1973 film Jesus Christ Superstar. Richler's book is a satire that tells the story of a Canadian Inuit who becomes pretentious after moving to the big city of Toronto. It features commentary on racism and materialism. But this story has a creepy history that involves scary coincidences. Many people say that the screenplay, which would be titled Atuk, is cursed. Over the years, the movie was never actually produced, even though multiple Hollywood studios were interested. But the scariest part of this strange story has to do with the actors who were once attached to the movie. The story goes that one of the first interested actors who read for the role of Atuk in 1982 was the comedian John Belushi. He was supposed to be set to star in the movie, but in a disturbing twist, he passed away on March 5, 1982, only months later at the age of 33. In 1988, when the movie began production again, Sam Kinison was interested in the role, but creative differences with the studio led him to leave the production. In another scary turn, he passed away in 1994 at the age of 38. One of the weirdest parts of this history is that some of the other actors interested in the lead role have had similar fates, including John Candy and Chris Farley. The curse of Atuk may be an urban legend. Todd Carroll, the scriptwriter, denied the curse in February of 1999. It's true that many other interested actors have survived long past production ended, including Will Ferrell, John Goodman, and Jack Black. But those who believe in a darker truth behind these crazy coincidences have found other potential evidence of the curse. Other comedians who passed away in the 90s include Phil Hartman and Michael O'Donoghue, both of whom had read the script. In the end, who can say if this creepy history story has supernatural origins? But you can't argue with the eerie circumstances of the production. And after all this time, the movie has still never been made. One particularly creepy type of coincidence relates to the repetition of specific numbers. One number commonly regarded as cursed is the number 13. In fact, a small portion of the population actually has a phobia of the number, including a classical composer, Arnold Schoenberg, often considered one of the most influential composers of the 20th century. Schoenberg's fear of the number 13 may have led him to intentionally misspell his masterpiece, Moses und Aaron, because of the 13-letter title, and he would label measures between 12 and 14 as 12A instead of 13. Perhaps this stemmed from his famous 12-tone compositions. While 12 is considered a perfect number, especially in ancient cultures, the number 13 is associated with darkness and bad luck. The creepiest coincidence in this story, however, is that in a way, Schoenberg actually did lose his life to the number 13. He passed away on July 13, 1951, which fell on a Friday, a notoriously unlucky day. Apparently, he had to spend the day anxious in bed, convinced he would meet his end, and he actually did. To make the story all the more unsettling, Schoenberg was 76 years old, and when you add the digits 7 and 6 together, you get 13, the number that always haunted him. There are actually a number of classical composers with superstitions. Mahler, for example, feared the curse of the ninth, the idea in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that a composer would never go beyond 9 symphonies. But perhaps no numerical coincidence in music history is as strange and creepy as the idea that perhaps the curse of 13 got Schoenberg in the end. Some of the oddest coincidences happen in the history of scientific discoveries. One particularly strange story has to do with discoveries made by the Italian astronomer Galileo Galilei, who lived from 1564 to 1642, and the influential German astronomer Johannes Kepler. Galileo has been referred to as the father of observational astronomy, and both he and Kepler challenged the idea that Earth was at the center of the universe. Galileo with his telescopic observations, and Kepler with his elliptical orbits. When Galileo observed Saturn through his telescope on July 25, 1910, he saw a round blob on each side. This turned out to be the first ever description of Saturn's rings, but his telescope didn't allow him to see them clearly. When he chose to share his findings with other astronomers and friends, he decided to pass the message along through a jumbled message in Latin that translated to, quote, "I've observed that the highest planet is threefold." At the time, Saturn was the farthest planet astronomers knew about, which is what he meant by highest. But a simple misunderstanding led to one of the strangest coincidences in the realm of weird scientific history. Kepler was one of the scientists who read Galileo's message, but he interpreted the anagram as a different Latin message, meaning "Be greeted, double knob, children of Mars." As strange as this message sounds, it fit with one of Kepler's recent theories, that Mars had 2 moons, since Earth had 1, and scientists only knew about Jupiter having 4. The misreading is an eerie coincidence because it was later discovered that Mars does have 2 moons, discovered over 250 years later in 1877. Kepler had made a major astronomical discovery based on a faulty anagram. Even more bizarrely, Kepler also mistranslated another message from Galileo. This time, Galileo's discovery related to the phases of Venus, an important piece of evidence that the sun was at the center of the universe, not the Earth. But Kepler thought the message indicated that there was a red spot in Jupiter, which rotates mathematically. What makes this so creepy is that for the second time, Kepler made a real scientific discovery that turned out to be true, even though he completely misread Galileo's intended message. Both men made discoveries that changed science forever, though in many cases, those discoveries happened by accident. Everyone knows the story of the Titanic, the luxury ship that sank on April 15, 1912. But while the sinking of the Titanic led to countless books and cinematic depictions, most notably James Cameron's 1997 epic romance, few know about the most bizarre cases of writers seeming to predict the Titanic disaster. In particular, there are 2 fictional stories that seem to depict the catastrophe years before it occurred, in the late 1800s. The history of the Titanic is a strange one, and there are many weird coincidences surrounding it, especially with these stories. The first is a story published in 1886 by W.T. Stead, a newspaper editor who pioneered investigative journalism. It's called "How the Mail Steamer Went Down in Mid-Atlantic by a Survivor," and it depicts a sailor who notices the limited lifeboats available on his unnamed ocean liner. The ship crashes into a sailing ship, and only 200 of the 700 people on board survive, with women and children given lifeboat access. The story even ends with advice from Stead, saying, quote, "This is exactly what might take place, and what will take place if the liners are set to sea short of boats." But the eeriest twist of fate is that Stead lost his life on the Titanic years later, falling victim to the same disaster that he wrote about. The other early depiction of the Titanic has even more weird similarities with the actual disaster. It's a novella called The Wreck of the Titan, or Futility, by Morgan Robertson, who wrote about an ocean liner that, like the Titanic, sinks after crashing into an iceberg. The ship is even called the Titan, a particularly weird coincidence. Both the Titanic and the Titan were called unsinkable, and the ships were around the same size. After the Titanic sank, Robertson was often called a clairvoyant, but he has always denied it. In reality, his experience and expertise in naval trends likely gave him the skills he needed to write a realistic story about a disaster that could and did actually occur. He said, quote, "I know what I'm writing about, that's all." Still, you have to marvel at the unlikeliness of these similarities. One of the strangest coincidences you may encounter throughout history is when people happen to survive multiple similar near-death experiences. One of the most unusual examples of this is Tsutomu Yamaguchi, a Japanese marine engineer who was a resident of Nagasaki in 1945, the year of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. At the time, he worked for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and was in Hiroshima on business on August 6th. That day, the US dropped the little boy atomic bomb on the city. He was 3 kilometers away from the site of the bomb when the explosion hit. While he miraculously survived, his injuries included temporary blindness, ruptured eardrums, and radiation burns on his left side. But this scary story becomes much creepier because it doesn't end there. It turns out Yamaguchi was also present in Nagasaki when the US dropped its second atomic bomb on August 9th, also 3 kilometers away. In fact, he was describing the first explosion to a coworker when the second explosion hit. While he had symptoms over the next week, including a high fever, he was not hurt. He did experience some health issues later in life as a result of the explosions, including cataracts and acute leukemia. And he also lost hearing in his left ear after Hiroshima. But he went on to live until the age of 93, when he passed away in 2010 from stomach cancer. Yamaguchi's story is fascinating and strange. At first, he had little interest in drawing attention to his experience as a double survivor, but he later went on to apply for double recognition. He was recognized as an explosion-affected person in 1957, but it took until 2009 for him to be recognized for his presence in Hiroshima. Now he's technically the only person to be officially recognized by the Japanese government as surviving both the Hiroshima and Nagasaki explosions. Throughout his life, Yamaguchi spoke out against nuclear weapons, saying, quote, "The reason that I hate the atomic bomb is because of what it does to the dignity of human beings." As the subject of one of history's craziest coincidences, he may know better than anyone. After Yamaguchi's death in 2010, the BBC featured him in the comedy program Chi, calling him the unluckiest man in the world. And while many called the black humor tasteless, there is an element of truth to that name. According to researchers, it might have been the earliest example of atmospheric and oceanic conditions having an obvious geopolitical impact. Centuries later, stories of Japan's divine winds would inspire soldiers in World War II, but the original divine winds may be an even stranger tale of an unsettling coincidence. In 1271, the Mongol Emperor Kublai Khan founded the Yuan dynasty in China. He controlled most of China, with his empire stretching up to Siberia. Relatives controlled a stretch of land that reached Hungary in the west, but he was not without challengers and still trying to subdue the southern Song dynasty. It was a fight he would eventually win, but Kublai Khan was looking for every advantage he could get. The Song dynasty still had a trade relationship with Japan, and the Mongol emperor wanted to put a stop to that. Multiple letters were sent to Japan to try to get them to capitulate. Whether the Japanese government were aware of the seriousness of the Mongol Empire, or if they simply didn't want to turn their backs on their Song allies is unclear, but Kublai Khan received no response. He spent years mustering up an armada to invade Japan. In 1274, hundreds of ships and thousands of soldiers from across his land were sent east. At first, it seemed to be an easy fight for the invading army, which was made up of Mongolian, Chinese, and Korean soldiers. The islands of Tsushima and Iki fell quickly. Then the invasion came to Kyushu, the southernmost of Japan's main islands. A force of samurai had been rushed into place to face the invasion, but they were ill-prepared for what the Khan's forces could do. The samurai tried to fight the traditional way, with one person coming forward at a time to engage in one-on-one combat, but the Mongol forces would surround the lone individual and take him out. The invading army also had superior weapons and munitions that the Japanese forces had never seen before. The Japanese had to retreat, and the invaders returned to their ships. Why they returned is still debated by historians. They may have believed the Japanese were retreating to prepare for an even larger force. It's also possible that the objective of the Mongols had never been to push inland, or that internal strife caused problems. By the next morning, the Mongol fleet was gone. Heavy rain and wind had arrived in the area during the night, and wiped out a significant portion of the fleet. The survivors had retreated to China. For the next 7 years, both the Mongol army and Japanese forces prepared for another invasion. In Japan, a defensive wall was built around the bay where the Mongols had first landed. In China, more ships were built and soldiers were conscripted. The second invasion would take place in 1281. The Yuan forces arrived in two parts. A smaller group from Korea arrived first, but could find nowhere to land. Without the larger forces from China, they couldn't overcome the defenses. Many boats were set alight by Japanese forces, who would row out to the ships in the middle of the night. The main force from China would arrive later, but they also couldn't find anywhere to land, and the original plan had to be changed. The Japanese managed to hold out for 2 months against the Mongol forces. On August 23rd, the fight would come to an end when a typhoon swept through the region. Most of Khan's great armada was destroyed and sent to the bottom of the ocean. Tens of thousands of soldiers would lose their lives in the open water. In Japan, it was believed that the winds had been sent by one of the Shinto gods, and offerings were sent to shrines for the gods of lightning and thunder and of wind. The strange coincidence that the Mongol invasion would be thwarted not once but twice by typhoons in an area not known for them today is still being debated by historians. There is archaeological evidence that severe storms took place around the same time that the invasions took place, and most seem to agree that the second typhoon intervention was true. Research is still being conducted as to whether the weather played a significant role in the demise of the first invasion, or if the real cause of the defeat is something even more mysterious. For some, business success is a matter of carefully planned purchases and detailed investigations into markets. For others, it's a matter of luck. Sometimes nothing but a series of strange coincidences is responsible for success, as was the case with Timothy Dexter. Historians are still debating just how much luck and coincidence played a role in his success. It's not clear if some of the stories about him are simply myths, but the legend of Timothy Dexter has survived through the centuries as one of the strangest series of coincidences in history. Dexter was born in Massachusetts when the U.S. was still a series of British colonies. When he was just 8 years old, he dropped out of school to start working as a farmer, and later took on an apprentice as a tanner. His fortune began to turn when he married a wealthy widow, but Dexter aspired for greater things. He wanted to mix with the local elite and to earn their respect. At the end of the American Revolutionary War, he purchased a large amount of continental currency. This had been printed during the war to pay soldiers and was completely worthless. Some wealthy individuals had purchased small amounts from soldiers, so the soldiers had actual money to survive upon. Dexter went further by spending his wife's savings on the currency. It should have been a disastrous investment that put Dexter back into poverty, but Alexander Hamilton had pushed the new U.S. government to buy continental dollars at 1% of the face value. Dexter's wealth multiplied overnight. The money still wasn't enough to convince the local elite that he was one of them. Dexter was illiterate, uneducated, and extremely eccentric. He spent a fortune on a grand chateau, and then even more money on specially commissioned statues that would stand around his estate. One of them was of himself, with an inscription declaring he was the greatest philosopher in the Western world. Other businessmen in the area believed a little humility would do Dexter some good, and began encouraging strange business decisions. One of these was to send bed-warming pans to the West Indies. These would have been commonplace in Massachusetts in the 16th century, but there wasn't much use for them in the tropical West Indies. Dexter had never been to the islands, but took the advice and sent many ships filled with pans to the Caribbean. People there had no idea what the pans were used for, but by a strange coincidence discovered that they had a perfect use in the sugar and molasses refining process. Another businessman encouraged Dexter to ship coal to Newcastle. Rather than advice, the phrase was actually an idiom used to describe a pointless action. Newcastle was the coal capital of the world, and it would be pointless to import coal there. Dexter had no idea about this and again decided to follow the advice. The coal arrived in Newcastle just as a minor strike took place. Again, coincidence had made a foolish business venture very successful. The pattern repeated again, with Dexter purchasing whale bones just as corsets made from the material became popular again. Dexter likely had some sales ability. He had charm that meant his self-published memoirs became wildly popular. But it seems reasonable to say that luck had a huge role in his overall success. Another instance where coincidental change of weather had a huge impact on a significant event was during the War of 1812. 2 years into the war, the British forces had mostly been on the defensive, with Americans launching attacks into Canada. For 2 summers in a row, the town of York, modern-day Toronto, had been attacked and government buildings were destroyed. But after the conclusion of the Napoleonic Wars, the main British force was now turning its attention to the US. An important objective for the British military was to take revenge for York, and Washington, D.C. was the perfect target. It was easy to reach by ship and was a symbol of the young American nation. Even if the people involved in the government weren't captured, taking Washington would be a huge blow to the morale of the Americans. On August 19th, the British landed in Maryland and began the march to Washington. On the way, they encountered an American force led by Brigadier General William Winder. The Americans had roughly 2,000 more men than the British, but these were mostly reservists. The British were veterans of war in Europe and much better prepared. Even though more British lost their lives in the Battle of Bladensburg, it was the Americans who lost the fight. It turned into a rout and earned the nickname the Bladensburg Races due to how quickly the Americans fled the scene. The way now lay open to Washington. The government there had been warned of the pending attack and had already fled before the British arrived. They left everything behind, including a meal that had been prepared by Dolly Madison and her staff for cabinet members. The British enjoyed the meal, then began to take revenge for York. Government buildings were set ablaze. The White House was one of the primary targets, but the Senate and House of Representatives, the Library of Congress, and the treasuries were all put to the torch. The British wanted to avoid private property, but it was unlikely they would have been able to control the fires once they were lit. The next morning, August 25th, the looting resumed. The army wanted to find any military supplies that had been left behind. Some historians believe that the British were getting ready to leave Washington that day, having achieved what they set out to do, and fearing an even larger militia. Others think the British could have been planning on extending their stay. Whatever the original plans, a turn in weather changed everything. A severe storm hit Washington, D.C. that day. Eyewitness accounts report the roofs of buildings being torn away, and some even claimed entire buildings were pulled from their foundations. British soldiers trying to enforce a curfew were forced to lie down in the mud to stop themselves from being blown away. It's believed that at least one tornado touched down on the city. The winds were so severe that an entire cannon was picked up and thrown across the street. The rain and wind did some damage to the buildings, but it also put out the fires that would have been left to rage unchecked. Even with the damage that had been done, it's likely that more of Washington was standing than would have been the case otherwise. The British promptly left Washington, and the war began to turn in favor of the Americans again. Months later, peace terms would be agreed upon, and work began to rebuild the capital. Some people live lives that mean they're more predisposed than others to experience some extraordinary events. A person who spent their life in politics is more likely to have met influential figures at key points in their life than someone without that background. But the coincidences surrounding Robert Todd Lincoln and his connections to 3 presidential assassinations is more than a simple numbers game. Robert Lincoln was the oldest of President Abraham Lincoln's 4 children, and the only one to live into old age. 2 of his brothers passed away in childhood, before a third passed away shortly after turning 18. Robert joined Ulysses Grant's staff in the final weeks of the Civil War. It was a role where he was unlikely to see combat, but he was present at Appomattox when Robert E. Lee surrendered. As his father was preparing to serve as president during peace times, Robert continued with Grant's staff. On April 14, 1863, Robert's parents invited him to join them on a trip to the theater. Robert declined the invitation. He'd spent a lot of time recently in a covered wagon and was looking forward to an early night. Hours later, he would be awoken to be told that John Wilkes Booth had attacked the president. Robert made it to the house where President Lincoln was being treated and remained at his side until he passed away. The experience was undoubtedly traumatic to the young Robert Lincoln, and it's understandable why he tried to resist suggestions that he also go into politics. He studied law, and it seemed like this was the career that he would dedicate his life to. But politicians were keen to put Lincoln in office. Robert feared that his name was more attractive than his actual abilities and turned down many requests, but eventually agreed to serve as Secretary of War for President James Garfield. Some legends claim that Garfield began to have strange dreams about his own passing in late June of 1881. Whether or not this was the case, he did seek out his Secretary of War to ask Robert for an account of what had happened after Lincoln was attacked. Despite this, Garfield believed he had nothing to fear himself and was unguarded as he arrived at Baltimore and Potomac train station on July 2nd. He was headed for a trip to New England, and a number of cabinet ministers and their wives would be joining him. Robert Lincoln and his family were supposed to be traveling with Garfield, but scheduling problems meant they would miss the first day of the trip. Robert traveled to the train station to inform the president of the change of plans. As Robert arrived, Charles Guiteau opened fire and 2 bullets struck the president. Guiteau believed he'd played an important role in getting Garfield elected and was frustrated that he wasn't being rewarded with a consulship. Robert later wrote that he reached the president in just 15 seconds. He immediately began directing people and organized for Garfield to be taken back to the White House. He played an important part in keeping things running while Garfield lay on his deathbed. Infection would claim Garfield's life months later, and Chester Arthur was sworn in as president. Robert Lincoln continued to serve as Secretary of War until the end of Arthur's presidency, then returned to his law practice. By 1901, Lincoln had switched careers again and was now president of Pullman Palace Car Company. Even with this important industry role, Lincoln didn't appear to have any plans to visit the Pan American Exposition that was taking place in Buffalo, New York that year. In fact, he'd been on vacation with his family in New Jersey. But then President William McKinley invited him to visit, so the Lincolns took a train to Buffalo on the evening of September 6th. Anarchist Leon Chugos was also attending the exposition. On September 5th, he'd attempted to take McKinley's life, but couldn't get close enough. He would have to wait until the following day and attack McKinley just before Lincoln's train arrived in Buffalo. Lincoln visited McKinley multiple times as the president recovered from his wounds. He believed McKinley's condition was improving, but an infection would become too serious to overcome, and McKinley passed away. The legend surrounding Robert Lincoln claims that he refused all presidential invitations from that moment onwards. But that wasn't quite the case, though he did believe he was cursed. When Theodore Roosevelt took office after McKinley's passing, Robert wrote a letter saying, "I do not congratulate you, for I've seen too much of the seamy side of the presidential robe to think it's an enviable garment." Thankfully, no other meetings in Robert's life led to further untimely passings, and he passed away peacefully at the age of 82. Roughly every 18 months, a solar eclipse happens somewhere on Earth. Partial solar eclipses are even more common, happening roughly every 6 months. That may sound frequent, but only a small part of the world will experience each eclipse, meaning an event in a specific location is rare. But on a cosmic scale, solar eclipses are even more rare. We only see them here on Earth due to strange coincidences. The Earth orbits around the Sun at an average distance of 149.6 million kilometers. The distance varies a little as the Earth goes about its orbit, but the Sun still appears roughly the same size in the sky. A finger held at arm's length is big enough to appear to cover the sun, at least from our vantage point on Earth. In reality, our star has a diameter of 1.392 million kilometers. That makes it a medium-sized star, but it's still by far the largest and most massive thing in our solar system. By contrast, our moon is just 3,474 kilometers in diameter. The Earth's moon is uniquely large compared to its planet. No other planet has a moon as close in size as our own is to Earth, and it's the 14th largest object in the entire solar system. The moon orbits the Earth at an average distance of 385,000 kilometers. This means that the moon is 400 times closer to the Earth than the sun, but also 400 times smaller. It's only due to this cosmic coincidence that the moon can perfectly cover the entire sun in the sky during a solar eclipse. On other planets, the moons would appear like black dots crossing the solar disk, as is the case on Mars. NASA's Perseverance rover was able to record Phobos' transit of the sun. While definitely interesting to look at, it's not close to the complete coverage seen on Earth during a solar eclipse. Another coincidence has to occur for a solar eclipse to take place. The moon doesn't block out the sun every time it moves between the Earth and the sun. The moon is in this position every month during the new moon phase, but because the moon's orbital plane is at a slight angle compared to the Earth's, the shadow it casts usually passes above or below the Earth. It's only when the moon's orbit crosses the Earth's orbital plane that a solar eclipse can take place. Solar eclipses haven't always been this way. Early in the Earth's life, the moon was much closer, and it would have dwarfed the sun in the sky, and eclipses would have lasted for hours. But the moon gradually drifted further from the Earth and is still drifting away at a rate of under 4 centimeters a year. Eventually, it'll get to the point where the moon no longer appears large enough to completely cover the sun. Astronomers don't believe this cosmic coincidence is important for the development of life on Earth, but humans have read meaning into solar eclipses since ancient times, and it's possible that certain historical events would have gone the same way without this strange coincidence. Throughout human history, we've been inventing and creating things that have an impact on the environment around us. Most of the time, that happens in a relatively limited capacity, but on occasion, there are inventions that have a global impact that'll last decades or even centuries. Of these inventions, two that have done the most damage to our environment are leaded gas and chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs. They were both invented by the same man. Thomas Midgley Jr. came from a family of inventors. His father worked on automobile tires, and his maternal grandfather invented the insert tooth saw. Midgley himself showed an interest in experimenting in chemistry class at school, but he went to college to study mechanical engineering. In 1916, 5 years after graduating, he joined General Motors' Delco Research Laboratory under Charles Kettering. The two got on well, and Kettering enabled Midgley's inventor spirit. The first of Midgley's disastrous inventions was leaded gasoline. At the time, knocking in car engines was a serious problem. It was caused when fuel burned unevenly in the engine and could lead to damage. Chemists in the automotive industry were experimenting with ways to eliminate that problem, and ethanol seemed like the perfect solution. Then Midgley came up with tetraethyl lead, a chemical that combined lead with hydrocarbons. When added to normal gas, the knocking phenomenon was completely solved. It even improved engine performance. The most attractive part of tetraethyl lead was the fact that it could be patented while ethanol couldn't. The main downside of this would be the fact that it involved lead. The dangers of lead were well known, and Midgley would have been aware of how dangerous his new invention could be. Despite this, experimentation with tetraethyl lead continued and it went into production. The company gave it the name ethyl, hoping the feminine-sounding name might hide the dangers. It worked to an extent, but in 1924, there were dozens of cases of lead poisoning at an experimental plant in New Jersey. Workers suffered from tremors and hallucinations, and 15 would pass away. Midgley held a press conference where he inhaled the fumes from leaded fuel and washed his hands with it. To the public, he had great confidence in his work and claimed the lead poisoning in New Jersey was due to workers not taking proper precautions. But privately, he was also suffering from lead poisoning. The scandal faded away, and leaded gas became the fuel of choice around the world. It's believed that this one invention caused over 1 million people every year to lose their lives, and may have been responsible for an increase in crime during the mid-20th century. Today, leaded fuel has been phased out, but the consequences of this environmental disaster still linger. Meanwhile, Midgley was working on solving another problem. Early refrigerators used refrigerants that were highly flammable. It wasn't uncommon for fridges to erupt in flames. To try to avoid this, the refrigerants were replaced by sulfur dioxide, which wasn't flammable, but was toxic, and could wipe out an entire family in their sleep. It took Midgley 2 hours to come up with chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs. These were non-flammable and didn't appear to be toxic. It was the perfect solution, and unlike lead, there was no reason to believe that there was anything dangerous about these chemicals at all. Freon-12 was put into production. It was then discovered that it was also perfect for aerosols, and Freon became an important chemical during the war effort, as bug spray was a necessary piece of equipment. Decades later, scientists would realize just how bad Freon and other CFCs had been for the environment. The chlorine in these molecules reacts with ozone in the upper atmosphere, destroying the ozone layer. This led to higher levels of UV radiation reaching the Earth's surface. CFCs, like leaded fuel, would later be banned, but the damage had already been done. On November 9, 1989, an official in East Germany made a clumsy announcement. Hours later, the Berlin Wall would be toppled and the separation between East and West Germany came to an unofficial end. The announcement came 71 years to the day after another shocking announcement that changed Germany forever. Today, the date is known as the Day of Destiny in Germany. Throughout the 20th century, significant events coincidentally took place on this date, each one symbolizing a significant change in the country. The first event associated with the Day of Destiny occurred before Germany even existed. Robert Blum was a poet, publisher, and politician from Prussia who argued for a strong, unified Germany. He was part of Germany's National Assembly, a short-lived government that existed after the fall of the Holy Roman Empire. During the Vienna Uprising in October of 1848, Blum and other members of the National Assembly traveled to Vienna to support the revolution. Events would not go in the revolutionaries' favor, and Blum surrendered on November 4th. 5 days later, his life would be forfeit. The German Revolution came to a swift end, but decades later, Germany would unify into an empire that felt ready to take on the world during World War I. The second significant November 9th date came at the end of the war. After years of fighting for the empire, the soldiers and workers in Germany were growing frustrated with the ruling elite. A naval order that prepared sailors for one last battle against the British Navy provoked a mutiny among sailors of the German High Seas Fleet. This sparked protests in other industries, and the revolution spread to other parts of Germany. It quickly became clear that things were going to change. On November 9th, the Chancellor announced that Emperor Wilhelm II had abdicated and the monarchy was no more. 71 years later, the Berlin Wall fell. Starting at 6 p.m. on the evening of November 9th, 1989, East German politician Günter Schabowski took part in a press conference where he explained changes to the requirements for traveling from East Germany to West Germany. For years, the country had been divided, as had the capital city. Traveling from east to west required special permission from the East German government, and even seeking that permission could lead to harassments and problems. Now, Schabowski announced that new regulations had been drafted, which would allow East Germans to travel to the west and stay there. He was asked when this would go into effect. Schabowski was uncertain of the answer, but told reporters that it was to take effect immediately. The announcement hadn't been planned, and the East German government hadn't intended for the border between East and West to be open. But it wasn't long before people began to arrive at the wall that divided Berlin, demanding to be allowed through. Within hours of Schabowski's announcement, the Berlin Wall had fallen. Official reunification would come months later. Unfortunately, not every November 9th event is something that should be celebrated, though. The date is also the anniversary of the Night of Broken Glass, when violent riots were orchestrated against Jewish people living in German-occupied areas. The riots were led by German military officers posing as civilians, but it's believed many civilians also took part. It was another turning point in German history, where prejudice turned into open violence. Today, November 9th is treated as a day of remembrance in Germany. Nostradamus may be one of the most famous names in history. The 16th century physician and astrologer made thousands of predictions about the future of humanity. Ever since these were published, people have been making connections between the predictions and real-life events. Skeptics will point out that the predictions are vague enough to be applied to anything, but that hasn't stopped some eerie coincidences from showing up, including predictions made during Nostradamus' own lifetime. Nostradamus' name first became famous when he published a series of almanacs. These included astrological information and predictions about the year. They were extremely popular and spread around France. In 1555, one of the people who acquired one of these almanacs was Catherine de' Medici, the queen consort of France. Catherine was of the infamous Italian Medici family. She wasn't royalty herself, but her family was very rich, and her uncle was the Pope at the time. The family had enough sway to arrange a marriage between Catherine and the French king's younger son, Henry. When Henry's older brother passed away, he became heir to the throne and would ascend in 1547. Like the rest of her family, Catherine was very interested in the arts, but there were also rumors that she was interested in the occult. She was definitely interested in astrology and predictions and hired many astrologers over the years. Early in her life, she was told she would pass away near Saint-Germain, the name of a famous church in Paris. It was another prediction that would coincidentally come true when a priest named Julien de Saint-Germain administered her last rites. After learning of Nostradamus, Catherine invited him to come to Paris to explain some of his predictions and draw up horoscopes for her children. She later made him counselor and physician in ordinary to King Henry's court. Nostradamus supposedly made many predictions about Catherine and her family, including that her 3 sons would become king. But his most famous prediction concerned her husband. He said, quote, "The young lion will overcome the older one. On the battlefield in a single combat, he will pierce his eyes through a golden cage. 2 wounds become 1, and he dies a cruel death." Much of Henry's reign had been spent at war with the Habsburgs, but in 1559, he negotiated a peace treaty. One of his daughters was to be married to the King of Spain, and there was cause for celebration. A jousting tournament was held, and Henry took part. His wife, mistress, and others in his court tried to stop him, especially after a joust with one of his own bodyguards unseated him. The guard was the Count of Montgomery, and he also tried to turn down the king's request for a rematch. King Henry insisted, and they mounted their horses again. Both men had shields with lions emblazoned on them and carried lances. The Count's lance hit the king's helmet and splintered. One splinter found a way through the cage and hit Henry in the eye. He received medical treatment from 2 of the best doctors in the land, but passed away due to sepsis 10 agonizing days later. The circumstances of the incident lined up perfectly, with the Count of Montgomery as the young lion beating the king in one-on-one combat. The golden cage referred to the king's helmet, and the nature of his wound could be interpreted as 2 wounds becoming 1. For some, this is proof that Nostradamus really could predict the future. For others, this was just a strange coincidence. The Battle of Midway marked a turning point in the Pacific Theater during World War II. It was the point where the Japanese Navy was stopped in its tracks after years of success. Hundreds of Americans lost their lives in the fight. Many took off knowing there was no chance they would be returning. But the casualties were far heavier on the Japanese side, in part due to some coincidences that aided the Americans. It was not only a matter of luck that the American forces won the Battle of Midway. Much of the work was done beforehand during intelligence gathering. Intelligence officers were able to work out roughly when, where, and how the Japanese forces were going to strike Midway, a small atoll west of Hawaii. They knew that the Japanese would try to ambush them with a much larger fleet, but because the Americans knew about this plan, they had the element of surprise. For the most part, the battle consisted of trying to destroy enemy aircraft carriers using aircraft, while also trying to defend their own carriers. The 2 enemy fleets wouldn't meet one another. Flying a plane over the enemy ship meant facing anti-aircraft weaponry, as well as enemy planes themselves. Countless pilots left the U.S. aircraft carriers, never to return. But despite all odds, they got the job done. All 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk, 3 going down within minutes of each other. There were 2 coincidences that helped the U.S. forces. The first was the squadron from the USS Yorktown coincidentally arriving above the Japanese carriers at the exact same time as squadrons from the USS Enterprise. The defenders were focused on fighting the Yorktown squadron, who were at a lower altitude and didn't realize the threat from the Enterprise planes until it was too late. The second coincidence was that the squadrons arrived just as the Japanese planes were refueling and rearming. This meant the decks were filled with the planes, fuel, and ammunition that would all be very volatile when hit by enemy munitions. In this instance, it was a case of the Americans making their own luck. The reason why the Japanese had to refuel and rearm was due to an attack that had taken place that morning. An hour earlier, 3 U.S. squadrons had charged at the enemy in an attack likened to the charge of the Light Brigade. There were no hits on the carriers during this charge, but without it, it's likely that the later push wouldn't have been as successful. There was no way of knowing when the Japanese forces would take time to refuel or rearm. If either the Yorktown or the Enterprise forces had arrived just a little later, the planes would have been refueled, and it's possible that even heavier losses would have been suffered before even one of the aircraft carriers went down. There have been many instances in history of people supposedly having premonitions in their dreams. Their dreams portray future events, sometimes with chilling accuracy that can make it seem impossible that this is merely a coincidence. In ancient times, the thought that dreams could predict the future was much more accepted than it is today. Today, we're more likely to believe that they're simply a reflection of what our subconscious mind is thinking about. The truth about dreaming and sleep in general is something of a mystery, even to experts, which only makes the creepy coincidences of premonition dreams even more disturbing. Of the premonition dreams, perhaps the most famous is that of Calpurnia, the last wife of Julius Caesar. Calpurnia married Caesar in 59 BC. She was part of a wealthy political family, and there doesn't seem to be much written about her. She was loyal to Caesar, even though his many affairs were an open secret in Rome, and helped to organize his estate after his passing. She was not particularly superstitious, although this was relative to society in general at the time. In 44 BC, Caesar's political ambitions had reached their highest point. A civil war between himself and former ally Pompey had lasted years, but now it was finally over. The victory had gone in Caesar's favor, and now he'd been declared dictator for life. His political campaigns had won him a lot of enemies, especially within the Roman Senate. Families who had held power for generations saw that slipping away as Caesar appealed to his soldiers and the poor. Even some who had fought alongside Caesar were now growing weary of his ambition. This might have been simply because they saw themselves falling out of favor, or possibly because they were trying to preserve the Roman Republic. Caesar himself had refused to be crowned and proclaimed there was no king of Rome other than Jupiter, but the Senate had announced that Caesar would become the official god of the Roman state after he passed away. There were lots of rumors about plots against Caesar swirling through Rome, and he had reason to be cautious about who he had around him. According to some versions of events, it was bad dreams that caused Caesar to seek out a soothsayer for advice. A bull was sacrificed, and the soothsayer found that the animal had no heart. This was taken as an ill omen, and Caesar was warned that his life would be in danger for the next 30 days. On the night of March 14th, both Caesar and Calpurnia would have dreams that would seem prophetic. Caesar dreamt of soaring through the crowds before being greeted by Jupiter, who welcomed him into his council. Meanwhile, Calpurnia dreamt of her husband being attacked by a bladed weapon and passing away in her arms. Both seemingly lined up with the future. The following day, Calpurnia was so alarmed by her dream that she begged her husband not to go to the Senate. This struck Caesar as strange, as she wasn't usually superstitious. Of course, he went anyway and would be struck 23 times. After his passing, he was worshipped by many, entering into the pantheon alongside Jupiter. Throughout history, cases of mass hysteria have produced some of the strangest cases. The dancing plague of the Middle Ages is possibly the most famous, and we often associate mass hysteria with a time when people were more religious and superstitious. This isn't always the case, as the 1962 laughter epidemic showed. But one of the weirdest cases of mass hysteria impacted some of the most religious and superstitious in society. It was the 15th century, somewhere in what is today Germany. For reasons unknown, an otherwise perfectly ordinary nun began biting other nuns at her own discretion. This would have been strange enough if it was an isolated incident, which could have perhaps been explained by a more typical illness, or even that the woman was having personal issues with other sisters. But rather than inflicting a traditional punishment for misbehavior, the other nuns also began to bite one another. News of this monastery of biting nuns spread around Germany. With the story came the infection itself. It seemed every nun that had heard about the plague of biting would soon find themselves affected. Saxony was badly impacted by the epidemic, but news traveled outside of Germany. Cases of biting nuns were found in Holland, France, and even Rome. Of course, prayer was the first method to try to stop this strange plague. Special masses were held, but they did nothing to combat the biting. The church believed demons were responsible, and when prayer didn't work, they insisted on trying to exorcise the demons. Local secular authorities had other ideas and suggested flogging and water dunking to force the nuns to stop. According to reports from the time, the biting stopped when the nuns became too exhausted. Other sources say it was the threat of medieval torture that made the nuns stop. But the biting stopped just as mysteriously and suddenly as it had began. What triggered this strange moment in history remains a mystery. Some point to the solitude that the women experienced, the poor living conditions, and the fact that many would have been forced into the nunnery as causing a mental break. When these very superstitious people heard about a disease that impacted their demographic, they believed they had caught it. Whether simply mental or a more physical condition, the biting plague is definitely one of the weirdest real-life history stories. Some of the weirdest stories in history are those of celebrities being kidnapped and held for ransom. It can be hard to believe movie stars or sports stars ever being in a vulnerable enough position to get kidnapped, but it has happened multiple times throughout history. What most of these cases have in common is that the victim is alive, at least at the time they disappeared. This wasn't the case when celebrity actor and comedian Charlie Chaplin was held for ransom, though. Chaplin spent the final decades of his life living in Switzerland with his fourth wife, Una. They lived in a small village and had 8 children together. On Christmas Day, 1977, Chaplin passed away peacefully in his sleep. He was 88 years old. The family had a small funeral, and he was buried in a graveyard near the Chaplin home. It was a simple affair, as he didn't want much of a fuss to be made. Chaplin's body remained there for about 2.5 months. Then Una Chaplin got a very strange phone call from the police. Somebody had dug up the grave, and Chaplin was missing. Not long after, Una Chaplin was contacted by a man calling himself Mr. Rochet. Rochet said that he had the body and wanted the equivalent of $600,000 for its safe return. Una thought that the request was insane and would tell the media that her husband would have thought it was ridiculous. She refused to pay the money. The criminal didn't give up and threatened Una's family. Before any harm could come to anyone, the police caught up with the grave robbers. They monitored Una's phone and 200 nearby phone booths. Sure enough, when the criminal called to make another demand, the police were able to apprehend him. Roman Wardus was the mastermind behind the plot. He'd heard of a similar story from Italy and figured this was a way to solve his financial problems. He enlisted the help of another man, and they dug up the body with plans to bury it deeper on the same plot. The weather made this too difficult, though, and they insisted on relocating the body to a nearby field. Wardus then acted alone in the extortion. He was sentenced to 4.5 years of hard labor, while his accomplice received an 18-month suspended sentence. Chaplin was reburied in the original plot with a concrete coating over his grave, where he remains to this day. One of the weirdest events in history took place off the coast of Spain during the Cold War. While the Cold War never did heat up, that didn't mean the war wasn't without its casualties, and some veterans and civilians are still living with the consequences of the nuclear standoff to this day. It was January 17, 1966, when a B-52 jet left a US Air Force base in North Carolina for a routine airborne alert mission. It was to fly east to the border of the Soviet Union and Europe. Then returned to America. It carried on board 4 nuclear weapons and 7 serving men. The flight would require 2 mid-air refueling flights over Spain. The first part of the mission went off without a hitch, but trying to connect with the refueling plane the second time would turn into a disaster. The B-52 approached the refueling plane, a KC-135, way too early. Usually, if there was any possibility of the 2 vehicles getting too close, those aboard the refueling plane would give the order to break away. The order never came. The refueling boom made contact with the B-52 fuselage. The refueling plane ignited while the B-52 broke apart. All those on board the KC-135 lost their lives, as well as 3 aboard the B-52. The 4 nuclear weapons plummeted to Earth along with the wreckage of the 2 aircraft. One of the weapons ended up in the Mediterranean Ocean. 3 landed in the southern Spanish countryside near the village of Palomares. The non-nuclear devices on 2 of the weapons were detonated, leaving behind large craters. But more significant was the plutonium dust that contaminated everything it touched. At first, the US Armed Forces and the local Spanish government tried to cover up the significance of the crash. Low-ranking American soldiers were sent to clean up the site with no protective clothing, after being told that they wouldn't need any. When villagers became concerned about radiation levels, soldiers were sent with devices to measure the high levels, but were told not to turn them on. The Spanish Minister for Information and the US ambassador went for a swim in the ocean off the coast to reassure everyone that everything was okay. Hundreds of thousands of tomatoes from the site were fed to the soldiers when local residents wouldn't eat them. To this day, a lot of information surrounding this strange story remains classified, and those who were exposed to radiation are still fighting for recognition from the Department of Veterans Affairs as they deal with cancers and other illnesses they believe to be caused by the exposure. We often think of the concept of workers striking due to pay disputes or working conditions as being a modern thing, but history stories show that it actually dates back thousands of years before the Common Era. Papyrus scrolls were discovered in Egypt that tell the story of a strike that took place in the 1150s BCE. This was during Egypt's New Kingdom, and while things were on shaky ground, it was far from the downfall of the kingdom. History's most mysterious group, the Sea People, had been defeated by the armies of Pharaoh Ramses III, but Egypt had also suffered heavy casualties. Combining that with a poor harvest, Egypt's economy was going through a pretty difficult period of history. While there was copper and myrrh in the temple's coffers, Egypt's economy ran mostly on grain, and that was also running low. There weren't enough people to work the fields, and there weren't enough merchants to do trade with other people outside the kingdom. Ramses III tried to fix the issues and traveled up and down his country to ensure his officials were doing their jobs correctly, and rituals were taking place according to tradition. In Egypt, like in many ancient cultures, a belief in the mandate of heaven, or that they were living in a way that the gods agreed with, was important. If they did that, the gods would grant them prosperity, and it was the pharaoh's job to ensure that the Egyptians did their best to make sure that this happened. But in 1159 BCE, it definitely didn't seem like that was the case to tomb builders and artisans. Unlike how pop culture likes to portray ancient Egypt, tomb builders were actually highly respected and well-paid members of society. But in 1159, their payments started to arrive late. Local authorities tried to solve the problem with grain distribution, but every time the workers were due to be paid, the payments would not arrive. This continued to happen month after month until the workers put down their tools and went on strike. This was the first recorded strike in world history. Workers marched into the city, proclaiming that they were hungry and that the late payments were a serious breach of their contract. Eventually, priest officials managed to negotiate with the striking workers and give them their back pay. But when they went back to work, they discovered that their next wage would not be coming. This time, the strikers protested at the Valley of the Kings and wouldn't let anyone come in or out. This was practically sacrilege, as part of the Egyptian culture at the time, involved relatives leaving food and drink offerings to the dead. The strikers would not let them. When guards threatened to remove the men, they threatened to damage the royal tombs. More than 3 years after the first late payment, in 1156, the issue was finally solved, this time for good, and the workers took up their tools again. It's a strange story not kept in the official records, but on papyrus scrolls only recently discovered, which leaves us asking what other weird stories might be waiting to be uncovered. In the 1960s and 70s, Green River in Utah was home to a weapons testing site that was utilized by the US military. From this site, they would fire scaled-down versions of intercontinental projectiles, which were aimed at white sands in New Mexico. The Athena projectiles were 50 feet tall, weighed 16,000 pounds, and made up of 4 stages that would detach at intervals like rockets used in space travel. These tests gave the military valuable information about how the Athena would land, information that they couldn't get from full-scale tests, which took place at sea. The majority of these tests went off as planned, but in the early hours of July 11, 1970, something very strange happened. The Athena left Green River at 2:30 a.m., and there was nothing to suggest anything unusual was going to occur. But when it appeared on the horizon of those watching at White Sands, they noticed the projectile was arriving at an unusual angle. Instead of landing at the site, the projectile continued overhead, crossing over the border and into Mexico. To make matters worse, the Athena nose cone carried 2 small containers of cobalt-47, a radioactive material. The military now had an international incident on their hands. Naturally, the Mexican government weren't impressed by the incident, but allowed representatives from the US military to come to Mexico to retrieve what remained of the Athena. On August 2nd, debris from the nose cone was detected in a desert area in the Mapimi region. This region is also sometimes known as the Zone of Silence, where computer equipment and things like compasses fail. Some have speculated that whatever causes the electronic and magnetic anomalies at the site also drew the Athena towards the desert. Only the nose cone of the Athena was found. Without the 3rd and 4th stages of the projectile, the cause of the incident remains unknown. The radioactive material aboard the Athena didn't cause much of an environmental hazard, but the US government agreed to take about 60 drums of contaminated soil from the site. The Athena incident wasn't the only case of projectiles accidentally crossing international borders, but it's definitely one of the stranger history stories. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But I've been Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.